Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome back to the show someone who needs no introduction, but as this is in fact the introduction, please allow me to introduce the one and only Phil Hine. Phil joins us today to talk about his latest book, Hine's Varieties, which means we have a good long chat about all kinds of fascinating topics. Queer paganism, Baphomet, Tantra, Chakras, and yes, even the old C word itself. Enjoy. Phil Hine, welcome back.
It's great to be online again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a while. It's been quite a few years. They add up. They go quick.
They do indeed.
They do. So we're here to talk about your, amongst other things, we're here to talk about your latest book. And so I guess the first question there is, why this book?
Well, why not? I've been writing on various occult topics now for 40 years, and I thought that's kind of a good marker to put together a kind of not so much a greatest hits, but what I really wanted to do with this book was to kind of show how my interest had kind of like branched into various subjects and how my ideas had changed over time. So, it's a kind of mix of some very early material, and what I'd try to do is looking at the various kind of like subjects like Tantra or sexuality, is take some like really early stuff and then take some much later stuff and kind of show how my ideas in a given territory have changed. And I also thought it'd be a good opportunity to kind of try and peek behind the scenes to try and say, well, this is actually what was going through my head or my heart when I was writing this piece, So it's an attempt to kind of lift the lid on my own process and to demonstrate that I'm kind of, although I'm mainly known for writing books on chaos magic, I've actually just kind of like one phase in my otherwise existence.
Absolutely. It's something David mentions in the intro. It's, if this is the autobiography we get out of you, then fine, that's good enough, because it is a really fascinating construct, as you say, like to put pieces together in it shows and contextualizes a life, which is what like a document of a life should do. And I think that it was really, really fascinating to read through in that sense. We're talking about, and actually I'll get you to maybe explain Hine's Varieties to Americans. But yeah, well, I was really impressed with how it kind of jumps up and down around time and subject to accomplish something, which is is to convey like how a person's ideas change over time, and it has that sense of time in it. It's well constructed.
Thank you. There's some pieces in it that I kind of wince at looking at now. Yeah, very important insofar as I thought they were important at the time that I wrote them, and I think I couldn't really shy away from saying, okay, well, this is a bit pants, or rather, I think of this as a bit pants now, but it's still kind of like an important essay for me at the time. It's kind of acknowledging stuff that perhaps in other circumstances you just might go, oh my God, I wish I'd never done that.
Yeah, well, I have over a decade of my stuff that's on public display on the blog, and that's like a long-running internet writer yourself, and sometimes I think about you get in a mood where it's like, God, I really need to go back and amend some of those earlier posts that are still getting traffic, and I'm like, actually, no. And there is there's a personal and kind of almost like historic validity to a document being of its time, I think.
I think so, yeah.
All right, so
if you're continually editing yourself, then no, that's a good idea.
I agree, and then it almost runs the risk of doing a bunch of things, which is messing with your sense of time, and not in a good sense, but also you might think you're cleverer than you are. There's something quite humbling about looking back at stuff where you go, well, that's not correct. What I said publicly a while ago is not correct.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also useful to acknowledge that,
Absolutely. So the title is for people who are kind of in the Anglosphere, a pun and a cute one. But Hine's Varieties, where did that come from?
Well, I guess for people who are not familiar with it, there's the Hines company who created Hines 57 Varieties, which was it's mostly in relation to kind of like baked bean cans. And with my name being Hine, the word for the company Heinz, Heinz, sounding phonetically similar, when I was at school, I got one of the things that other kids used to taunt me with was Heinz Beans. So that was my nickname for, while I was growing up, Heinz Beans. Very funny. So when I started to kick around the idea of writing this, if you like, self-reflective anthology of my own work, I just thought, Heinz Varieties, let's take that on with it. And some people said to me, "Oh, the Heinz going to get really pissed off." And I checked this out with the publishers, and they were kind of like, "Well, no, we don't think so."
But also, they can't do anything. It's actually your name.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, a fairly accurate description of the contents, because I have, written in a whole kind of like quite a wide range of different occult genres, from paganism to chaos magic to tantra to fiction,
Absolutely.
So I think it's a good title for what the content is.
I would agree completely, and the way it's structured for people listening to the show is in these sections, as you said, like paganisms and sexualities and fiction and all this kind of stuff. And there are contextualizing essays or introductions at the beginning, both of each section and chapters where relevant. One of the things I want to ask, because it doesn't move in a classical chronology of I was born, and then I grew up and so on. How did you manage to live in so many villages? Because like half the essays you were opening up, like, no, I was living in a village here at the time, and I'm like, I tried that for years, and I could never get work to be able to afford it. I'm like, he's living the dream. He's living the 80s dream, living in these villages in the Peaks district and so on. Was there like a trick that I missed, or was it a different time? What's going on there?
Well, I think it's a different time. When I lived in the Peak district, I was a student the first time round, and then the second degree I did was in occupational therapy, which I talk a lot about in the book. But the thing about occupational therapy was that once you'd done your basic training, they moved you around on placements. I got to live all over I spent 6 weeks here or 2 months there doing work placements.
Right. There we go. There was a trick.
I was moving around and quite a bit,
I guess you mentioned it quite early on, I think in the early 80s, 81, 82, a fair amount of hitchhiking, visiting other occult friends and so on. And that, again, is a mode of transport for another time, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it just doesn't happen nowadays, does it?
No. And it's in keeping with freewheeling youth. I like it, but I wanted to know, just as I'm reading through, going, he's in another fucking village. How is this possible? Anyway, now I get it. Now there's the capitalism behind the itinerancy I get, and I'm jealous of. There you go. Okay, so a couple of pieces I want to, I guess, hit right off the bat. I know people will be expecting chaos magic, but there's a few more before we get to it. And the first one, I think, is in the paganism section. And because there'll be method to my madness, I promise, by the time we get there. So and this was interesting to me. Queer paganism. What do you mean? What did you mean? And maybe what do you mean by both words now? Because
it's a huge subject, and I think it's, what's interesting about it. It means very different things to very different people, and that's often country specific. So when I talk to American pagans, what they mean by queer paganism and we mean over here by queer paganism are kind of two different things. Of course, people have a wide range of opinions about what's queer, what's pagan, and what's I find interesting is kind of what happens when you put them together.
Yeah, so I agree. There's something country specific about it, and also the term queer has maybe I'm just grumbling, normalized to a point of limited utility, so that Miley Cyrus can marry this very Aryan-looking white man and say she's still queer doing it. And when I back in the old-timey days, like when I was at university doing all those incorrigible postmodern things in the early noughties, queer had a very specific academic context that was beyond gay or whatever. It was something else, and now it appears to be interchangeable with either whatever you want or like normie gay, and I think about that sometimes, going, I wonder, at least part of that must be country specific, but it also seems to have, maybe, I don't know, I'll get your opinion on that. I feel like it's lost some of its semantic teeth.
It's one of those terms that almost, the way queer was conceptualized by academics was as a kind of a term that can't be defined. And I think that's kind of achieved its aim. I mean, I've got friends who are queer pagan practitioners who will say, I'm not lesbian, I'm not gay, I'm not bi, whatever, I'm queer. And they see it as a distinct identity from all those other kind of possibilities. And then there's some people who, yes, use queer as a synonym for being gay or bisexual or transgendered or intersex or whatever. So it has a huge range of possibilities around it, but it's kind of like an indeterminate term. And I'm thinking that might be a good idea to keep it indeterminate, if you like.
I think I rankle a little bit at it as if queer as a center of gravity is pulling in terms that it previously hadn't. So that's fine as an umbrella term, but I think it's the interchangeability. I think you should be able to be gay without being queer. And that's
and many people are.
Yeah, I worry about contemporary mobilization of the term, right?
Where I'm not queer, I'm gay,
Yeah, exactly. And that was interesting to me because the discussions of the queer paganism stuff in the 90s, which we'll talk about in a second, it had, the term was used in the way I was exposed to it, I guess, in university, and I'm just wondering what that looks like over time. But again, like the other point, and we'll talk about this, paganism itself has changed from or describe some fairly alarming stories in the 80s to do with persistent homophobia in paganism. Let's talk about that. People, because it is hopefully very inclusive now. That hasn't always been the case, has it?
It hasn't always been the case. And I think, again, that's a very British-centric experience. I know things have been very different in the States. But, my experience of being queer and moving around in pagan occult circles is up until about the 2000s. It was still fairly normative to get a lot of kind of like, if you like, microaggressions, nudging and winking behind people's backs kind of thing. And I think the overt, the overt kind of like narratives about why, if you're gay or lesbian or bisexual or queer indeed, you can't be involved in occultism. Those things have kind of like fallen off. You don't tend to get them repeated in books and magazines anymore. But that's not to say that I think the inclusivity is sometimes overstated, if you like.
Yeah.
Because there's this overwhelming narrative that paganism has always been, friendly and inclusive to, let's say, people who aren't straight. And I don't think that has been the case at all, at least not in the UK. It's kind of like I think things have been different in other countries, yes, but my experience and that of a lot of my friends in the UK is, no, you haven't been very inclusive, and when people go off and create their own queer pagan spaces, eventually, oh, why did you do that? Why did you go off and well, actually, you were so fucking awful, we didn't want to be around normal pagan spaces. We wanted to create our own safe spaces for experimenting and play with people, coming up with bullshit theories, like block chakras or reverse Kundalini or all that shit.
Yeah, and I would describe them as all symptoms, right, of an underlying naive philosophy, which is why I've, it's been many a year since I've identified as pagan, because it's sort of underlying cosmic penises and vaginas is just the stupidest, like 150-year-old Anglican shit, like Anglican antiquarian Freudian shit. And if that's how you think reality is run, then of course you're going to spend many decades having these ridiculous hot takes about lesbians or trans people or whatever. And that's the bit, because in this sense, I don't think it is confined to the UK. It's there's been some persistent and fairly wildly toxic transphobia from elders from that time in the US that's kind of brought down conferences and so on. And there's symptoms of like,
you're talking about Ziggy Budapest and Co?
That kind of thing, yeah. And it's if you look at the underlying philosophy, like their literal metaphysics is in the toilet. So then how are they, everything that falls out of that isn't going to be particularly conducive to flourishing?
I'll give you an example, Gordon. It's about 10 years ago. I was living in Brockley in South London. And we found there was a coven of witches in Brockley. Went along to a meeting, get talking to this guy. Oh, I'm gay, but I believe in Wiccan polarity. So I'm like, oh, okay. Well, how does that work for you then? And he goes, oh, well, when I'm in the circle, I'm straight.
Jesus.
Okay. Whatever, And these were the kind of witches that even for having a party, they had to like do that whole male, female, male, female, male, female, Before we could have a glass of beer, we all had to get into male, female, male, female.
It's like a wedding. It's a wedding reception in the 1950s. That's the stupidest thing ever.
No. When in the circle, I'm straight. I'm not going to, go any further down that route, but interesting.
Yeah, and I guess at least as far as I can tell, looking at it on the internet, again, paganism hasn't been my world for a while for reasons that we're pretty much picking over now. I do think it's improving, and it's improving because, at least in the majority, I would hope it's the actual underlying metaphysics that is improving, so that it's sort of impossible to have those stupid takes if you've actually done the philosophical and metaphysical work about, on a personal basis, about how you think the universe and you and whatever actually works. And there's and also I just sort of feel like, and we're going to talk about Baphomet now because there was a few air punch moments. The queering Baphomet piece that's in it, that's in your book, I don't think I'd read before. And I really, really enjoyed it because that's a really good example of how if you don't go with a 19th century antiquarian understanding of agricultural goddesses, which is pretty much the off-the-shelf Wiccan options, there are entities with which one can tango that make it literally impossible to end up in those kind of homophobic or transphobic or whatever realms. And this whole you got a whole piece on queering Baphomet. And here's a bit, I'll get you to describe this for the folks. Baphomet is unfinished in a Deleuzian sense. So explain what you mean by that, because that was an air punch moment for me. I really enjoyed that.
It's, that is a good, I thought that was a good piece for the book, because not only am I talking about an experience at Queer Pagan Camp, but it's also kind of showing, I first did work with this Wiccan high priestess, and then I did the whole IoT thing. In a way, that article is charting my relationship with a certain kind of practice and a certain kind of deity through to different phases, So I was particularly pleased with that one. I've done a follow-up article last year on the blog called Baphomet posing as sodomite, which is a kind of critique of the whole kind of like hyper-masculinity of that you get with a lot of Baphomet stuff, you know.
No, absolutely. I think it's because you mentioned the IoT stuff. Massive Chaos B is one of the more persistent things, and it's not that. It's also an article or ritual of its time, and I remember something Pete Carroll said maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that if you make Baphomet everything, you make it nothing, and there is actually something about its composite form. This bit, so I'm reading straight out of the book. Unlike the classical deities of familiar mythologies, they had no role, no place in a pantheon, no easily assigned function. This was how I began to think about Baphomet, something that lived beyond the boundaries and routes through which I normally thought of entities in terms of magical work. So there's a permanent hybridity and unfinishedness, and crucially, I think, from like a Deleuzian or anything postmodern direction, it doesn't have a function. So it's not an entity of a mechanistic universe. This is the rain god. This is the earth goddess. Baphomet,
this is the god that you go to fix your taxes. You know, it's not an instrumentalist deity.
No,
you know, this is a deity for doing stuff you don't expect, or for seeking experiences that are outside your current range of experience. You know, to invoke the unexpected, if you like. You know, this isn't a kind of like, what is the lesson of Baphomet? I don't know. Just wait and see, you know.
And it is that. Yeah, you tangle with, and it ends up really weird. It was gratifying to see that you had similar, almost like subsequent para-historical musings. My biggest Baphomet stuff would have been about a decade ago with Hellfire Caves and a 5-day fast, and then mushrooms in Amsterdam and that kind of stuff, all in the sequence of a sort of long weekend. And you tangle with it, and you end up getting I don't want to say ahistorical, because it's almost like the folkloric understanding of the charges against the Templars. And it's actually, even though the history of it is not correct, like that's not actually the story of the Templars, there's something about it that's true when you tangle with the Templars, that you get this sort of subversion, but also it's like a portal of inclusivity from outside the Anglosphere into it. You actually get the Templar interest in Persian mysticism and all that kind of stuff just sort of flowing through it if you once you encounter it. And I thought it's really fascinating that it doesn't have a function beyond its function is to not have a function, almost. Does that make sense?
Yeah I think that's a good description of it, or at least what I was trying to get to in that article, you know.
It was a good one.
I think a lot of magic, particularly in the 90s, became very instrumentalist. It's kind of like, you know, what is the function here? I'm going to do that to get this. I think that became one of my kind of like critiques of chaos magic, that it was extremely instrumentalist.
Oh, absolutely.
And it was, you know, it's kind of one of the things I like to say about Austin Osman Spare. Well, you know, yes, Spare sigils, but you look at Spare sigils, he wasn't going for, you know, a better job or a bigger car or more women. I mean, this guy lived in a bombed out flat, you know, full of shit and cats. This guy was not interested in you know, accumulating stuff. He wanted to have weird. My take on him is he wanted to have weird experiences. You know, he wanted to foster obsessions and fantasies, which
he
to
did.
me is a kind of like a more interesting kind of like use of magic than just using it to accumulate more shit.
Agreed. And it's funny because I've obviously made notes before we had our discussion, and the points are paganism, we've discussed it, Baphomet, and because of your description of Baphomet, it brings it into, and it's the same idea in your head, I can tell, the shortcomings within chaos magic. And I'm 100%, it's funny, I wrote about this in the beginning of Pieces of 8, which is that the instrumentalism or the overfixation on results inside chaos magic is both its greatest strength and definitely its greatest weakness, particularly from a philosophical perspective. because the other side of the coin, and this is true, and I'm sure we both have friends and colleagues who are like this or have been like this, where failure to achieve something that you have publicly gone to get or gone after is excused or metaphysicked away with mysticism, and that doesn't, and so it's sort of like, yes, there's a need for kind of cold rigor in going after the things that you actually want in life, and it's a desire thing rather than a operate more fluidly in capitalism thing. But by the same token, that's insufficient as a total metaphysics. Like you can't just, you can't just go, okay, well, the rest of it's extraneous. Let's just get a better job.
But by that, do you mean kind of like, oh well, if magic worked, then I'm a great magician. If it didn't work, then it's karma or the cosmic tides, or
exactly. And that is
the law of threefold return. So some more metaphysical get-out clause,
Correct. And I still think that chaos magic has a starkness that makes that sort of thing impossible. It's not without its shortcomings, and the main shortcoming is that same thing, which is you can't build an entire philosophy around improving the manifestation of physical results, right? Like that's I mean, you just get bored of it really quickly.
Well, I think chaos magic does have a philosophy, but it's the kind of like it's the normative neoliberal Western philosophy that's all around it. It just never examined that,
100% agreed. 100% agreed. And that's and funnily enough, because I think about this in concert with my other great love, which is permaculture, which also has philosophical shortcomings that I think, and I tried to do this with my most recent book, I think in Chaos Magic's case, contain the possibility for its redemption. Because we'll talk about what you talk about whether Chaos Magic has a goal or a macro goal in it. And you're correct that it's just inherited a philosophy from the prevailing temperature at the time, or the prevailing conditions at the time, which, bearing in mind, mid-80s Britain, there are better economic philosophies to inherit. I like to think of chaos magic as the bastard child of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Correct. There is that the neoliberalism that you have in there. If it's not examined, it gets snuck in with your food. Like all of a sudden you think neoliberalism is reality rather than the thing that was around when chaos magic was formed. But I think here's my take on what I think the goal, if chaos magic has a goal or strength, it is a nice way of saying what we've been talking about. So the pleasant side is that it is optimized for optimization. And that, I think, contains the seed in the same way permaculture has a similar idea. I think that contains a seed for its possible philosophical redemption, because having inherited neoliberalism is a non-optimal situation. So chaos magic should, in theory, optimize itself out of its non-optimized state by focusing on that kind of like Reaganaut efficiency idea. It should eliminate that Reaganaut efficiency idea. That's my vain hope that it does accidentally have a goal, because and I think I do my best to get there, right? Like, as a result, it needs to have an emphasis on decolonialism and all this other stuff to unpick and remove, because it's non-optimized, the things that it has either didn't have time to or was not interested in examining.
I think a lot of people are not interested.
Yeah.
One of Pete Carroll's more famous statements is there are two kinds of chaos magicians. There's the rational, scientific magician, and there's the anarcho-romantic chaos magician. And I think in his perspective that, the scientific rationalist chaos magicians will be the people who would inherit the earth. But I think I always saw myself on the side of the anarcho-romantic.
Well, yes. That again, he says some things, and that's perfect, because yes, hard same. we're on the same side of that philosophical divide, I guess. And funnily enough, anarcho-romance does have empirical rigor, if you do it correctly. It just doesn't mean you have to talk about molecules. And that, so I thought that was really kind of interesting that its over focus on results is its shortcoming and sometimes strength. But it was really fascinating. I think you've done even potentially more gentle work than you could have in conveying your experience with chaos magic, and in particular coming out of it in a sense of almost disappointment in the book. And that was kind of fascinating to read through.
Oh, and what I wanted to kind of like make clear was that, you know, I didn't just pop up out of chaos magic, that I went from, if you like, Wicca to chaos magic. And that was something that I very much wanted to go through, because I think I had some very interesting experiences in Wicca, which kind of like almost help explain my particular attitude to chaos magic. And the fact that I kind of like ducked into Lovecraftian magic on the way, with even before I got into chaos magic, you know.
Well, that this is a delightful, youthful story, and there's a couple. Actually, it's germane to this conversation. So maybe talk people through the Yog Sothoth Hilltop story. And,
that thing.
Yeah, go for it. Because then there's a bit. It comes up a couple of times in the book, but tell people that story, and then there's a point where you say if the internet had been available at the time, you might have been talked out of it. So tell us the story, and then we'll have that discussion, because I'd be interested to be given that you've been in this for so long.
It's simple enough. I mean, I got into Lovecraft in my late teens. I bought that Simon Necronomicon. I actually had the hardback. I remember I was a Huddersfield Poly at the time, Polytechnics for what we now call kind of like red brick universities. And I remember bringing it back and showing it to a couple of my friends who were into Lovecraft. I go, wow, the Necronomicon. And I was living in a village, one of those villages, on the edge of the Pennine Chain, which has some really kind of like huge mountain ranges. So, you know, I knew a couple of people at the Poly who were into the occult, and they all basically went, oh, don't know if that's a good idea. But I said, well, you know, I want to try and evoke Yog Sothoth, which drew a kind of like a number of kind of like comments, as you can imagine. But I just thought, oh, fuck it, I'm going to go for it. So I went out, and I really can't remember the whole thing in detail, but I remember kind of like chalking signs of some kind on the rocks on this mountain top, and kind of like doing a lot of chanting and, you know, muttering of dead names and all that kind of thing. And all of a sudden I felt really freaked out, and I kind of like looked above me, and I don't know whether I hallucinated this or not, but I kind of like this like beam of light coming out of the sky onto the mountain. Could have been a helicopter for all I know. And I was like, fuck. And I basically ran off the mountain. Still remember kind of like my torch swinging this way and that, and catching the occasional surprised sheep in the beam. And I ended up on the other edge of the village at a mate's house, and he was like, I told you something like this would happen. Not very sympathetic at all. And, you know, that was one of my first big ritual magic freakouts. And the thing about the internet is, if I'd have gone on if I'd been doing that, or wanted to do that ritual now, and I'd gone on a big occult internet forum like Barblith or something like that, I'm sure there would have been plenty of people to talk me out of it. And, you know, I'm glad I didn't have that option, because obviously, you know, I think it was important that I did that, because I was kind of like approaching magic from a very much a kind of like, oh, it's all psychology, it's all safe kind of perspective. And I think one of the big impacts of that ritual was to show me, actually, it is possible to shit yourself whilst doing ritual magic and to get completely freaked out and frightened. And I think that was a good experience. You know, it's not safe. We think of magic, it's mostly safe, you know, apart from the odd excuse me, the odd existential terror. But I think throwing a really good scare into stuff is almost kind of like necessary.
Oh, it's fundamental, absolutely, because you, as you say, you went up the hill thinking magic is equivalent to psychology, and probably didn't have such lofty thoughts on the run down the hill. But at some stage, it forces you.
I had no idea what was going to happen, you know. But certainly I didn't expect to end up running for my life, kind of thing, or just running scared.
Yeah, and you when you sit with it, you have to do two things, and that's what I like about when those experiences happen, right? Which is like I've got at least one thing wrong in my head here, which is either I've made psychology too small or I've made magic too small. And so you can when you sit with it, go, well, in fact, magic is identical to psychology. It's just that you have to make psychology much bigger for that to be true. Or you have to go, no, psychology is kind of bind it to its own self-declared history and have that sit in a much more vast ocean that is magic, right? And I think I agree that you have to have those inarguable experiences. So, I mean, this is kind of like a hot take thing, but what do you think? How would you today metaphysically describe what that was? What happened to you? Because it's a given that it comes from.
Well, I've never been back to that mountain. It might still be haunted by a demonic presence of a great old one.
There you go.
It's shit is about the best I can manage. I think there's a lot of magical experience I've had for the category of I have no way of explaining this, and I'm not even going to try.
All right,
it was weird, I mean, some things we're really good at explaining with our current explanatory frameworks, and some things we're not. Is the way I kind of look at it, and that's one that falls into the not category.
But is that its role? Like, can we explain it as a thing that needs to be inexplicable to kind of keep the universe big?
Yeah, I think I'm quite happy to have limits on explainability in order to feel like a sense of wonder.
I'm going to ask you about wonder. Should we do it now?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Because this is in the context of Tantra and so on. But how do you? Again, now that we've spoken about correctly the sort of instrumentalist shortcomings of chaos magic, I have to watch how I phrase my questions. But tell us your understanding of wonder, and this is the red alert bit, what it's used for.
I'm not sure it has a use. But,
correct.
Wonder can be something really simple, like sharing a glance with some train station, when you hear the train's going to be 40 minutes late, or it can be, looking at the light glancing off a raindrop and having a beatific vision. It's kind of like that. I would characterize it as a sort of a recognition of joy, even if it's only something momentary. There's a fundamental joyness out of existence, rather than the, oh my God, another day. It's just something that can lift you momentarily out of the doldrums, or can go on for hours. And what's interesting, what I find interesting about the term wonder is it's often a term that you find used in tantric texts. They will specifically say, this is the yoga of wonder. And there's something powerful that we sometimes miss, again, in this kind of like very instrumentalist approach to the cult, of just going, wow. I mean, I used to do things like I'd sort of pick up a ballpoint pen and pretend like I'd never seen a ballpoint pen before. And I go, wow, mate, and look, you could write on it. And I'd always try and cultivate a kind of naivety about things. This was my counterbalance, which I don't think I've really gone to. Well, I haven't actually mentioned at all in the book, but for one particular phase in my life, I kind of tried to counterbalance the severe kind of like dark shit of Lovecraft with almost like a kind of trying to do a C.S. Lewis Narnia take on magic. And just trying to go for a kind of like, instead of the kind of like, depressive outsiderness you get in a lot of Lovecraft and even the all-knowing the chaos magician, I tried to actually deliberately cultivate a sense of naivety. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like it. There's been a couple of moments now that I don't know what I'm doing. I've only been down here a year and a half, but now that we've got this farm down here, there's a couple of moments recently where I've been doing things that are very new to me, but are very old to mankind, to do with it's spring here, and tying vines so that they grow in the right direction, and all this kind of stuff. That I'm like, I have moments of, I could see why, and we'll talk about it. Like Tantra's mobilization of wonder as being cosmically significant. You have moments like that, like the stolen glance at a train station or sun coming through the clouds, where it is. I hate the word transcendent because I think it's all one stuff, but like there is something profound about it that kind of unpicks the certificate gathering that you get from that 19th century Masonic style order model of Golden Dawn and OTO and anything where you climb up a ladder to be like a all powerful mystic wizard, or the on the ground, almost like or the on the ground instrumentalism of like, I'm good at magic because I'm rich, chaos magic idea. There's something about it that I think people, and it's described in the book well, but I think people need to sit with. Wonder is cosmically significant.
It's and what I like about wonder is it's an everyday experience. You don't have to kind of like, go up the tree of life to find it. It can be around the next corner. And I think it's a cultivation of the capacity to be surprised by the everyday. Is, I think, how I'd characterize my approach to it.
I like that. To be surprised by the everyday and
take delight in that,
Yeah. And be somewhat humbled by it. I don't know. Maybe that's my feeling about it. But
there's just jumping into the chakras for a moment. I was writing this material on the the Mooladhara Chakra, and there's these four goddesses that reside in the petals. Now you'd think with all the stuff about the Mooladhara, in modern Western discourse, it's the lowest chakra. It's to do with, I don't know, crapping yourself or materiality or survival instincts or anal things, depending on who you read. But it's kind of like really low down the scale. But in this tantric text I was reading, these four goddesses who reside on the petals of the Mooladhara, they're four goddesses of bliss. And I was kind of thinking, wow, this is really amazing. This is an acknowledgement of the kind of like of that kind of, like, that sense of joy and wonder in the everyday and in our embodied experience, if you like.
It's it's something that occurred to me. We'll get to the chakras because I find that stuff, the work you did on it, fascinating. But the way we have them stacked, it's capitalist white people can't help but climb a hierarchy. So like the root chakra, you just race past. Who cares?
Yeah.
Like throat and up or bust.
It's like what's saying in the book about basic exercises and advanced exercises. I really don't like that distinction, because it's like, I've met innumerable people who go, oh yeah, I've never done that, that's basic. I just wanted to get on and do the really, the really get hard magic, and that's all, that's all basic stuff. I don't need to bother with that. And I should think, no, basic stuff is stuff you do all the time. It's the core practices. It's the thing you constantly are doing, and the other stuff is just optional. And I know I'm jumping around a lot, but this is kind of what I think in the book, because in the book, the book isn't, as you say, a chronological narrative, because I got into several things at roughly the same time.
No, exactly.
That's kind of why separating it out had to be done like it was, because I think at one point I was writing about chaos magic, paganism, and tantra and sex all at pretty much the same time.
Well, they've got to be untangled.
There's no need. Yeah, it was very hard to kind of like, okay, how am I going to make sense of the various pies I've had my fingers in over the years? But I think it's worked. generally.
it has. It has. We should, before we get to chakras, because we just kind of pulled a piece out of it, which is the wonder thing, which would constitute an example of a basic exercise. And that's the kind of thing. It's just English language, which I love, by the way. But the terms we've inherited unless you interrogate them, that are used in kind of Western magical discourse, generally aren't up to code for it. And those kind of definitions are 19th century inheritances that most decent or operant magical users have kind of blown past. Because a good example would be, well, by that definition, sitting with or noticing wonder on a daily basis constitutes basic, and that is, like, I would say, objectively better than in the long run, and maybe even on a daily basis, than running down a mountain terrified after invoking a great old one, which would count as one of the more extreme kind of ritual examples, right? And the wonder thing is a basic one.
Yeah, it's something you could do every day, you know.
Exactly.
I mean,
and it's powerful. It's not that it's like the bigger ones are more. Yeah. It's not that the bigger ones are more powerful. It's, if anything, the trick is that the opposite is the case if you're doing the daily ones correctly.
Yeah, really, really simple things can have really profound effects.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, rather than pulling although there's a case to be made, I think, for pulling out the stops, you know, and getting your sparkly robes on and you know, invoking whoever. Okay,
for sure,
you know,
for sure. All right, so the Tantra stuff, this is an interesting, I can see why the book is non-chronological and how you found yourself at one stage writing about 4 of the main topic areas at the one time, because they are implicated in the same way that Wicca predates your move through chaos magic. Tantra did in its own kind of funny way as well, doesn't it? So, like,
it did very much so.
So talk us through that bit.
I mean, it is just to come back to, I mean, I first encountered the, if you like, the texts of chaos magic whilst I was in a Wiccan coven, and it was the Wiccan high priestess who said to me, you know, go out and find out more about this stuff because I haven't got time. And it was when I came back from being on a kibbutz in Israel in 1982, and I was living in yet another little village. And I started to have this recurring dream with Carly in it. Now, you know, I knew who Carly was. I'd read Kenneth Grant books after all. But I'd never had that kind of, you know, people say, oh, well, you know, I was drawn to this, or I always knew I was a high priest of this in my previous existence. None of that shit. I wasn't that interested in Indian stuff at all. In fact, what I'd read, I think it was probably an Arthur Avalon book on something or other, and I just thought, no, I can't deal with this stuff. It does my head in, you know. So I was familiar with the kind of like who Carly was at least from a kind of Kenneth Grant to mashup point of view, but I was not drawn to her. I was not drawn to it. So getting this dream coming night after night, and it's mostly the same dream. I'm meeting Carly in a cremation ground full of burning corpses. It was like really scary. At that time, I was like, I'd kind of become adrift from those occult friends I had. So the only thing I could do was write the thing up as a kind of path working and do meditations on it during the day. And I found that going through it as a kind of path working as I went to sleep actually made the dream more intense. And what happened was in the end, I kind of got back in contact with the Wiccan circuit I was on, and they were going, oh, you must have been the priest of Carly in your previous life. And I was going, no, bollocks to that. But that's what kind of like put the hook in me. And what I wanted to do was, because at that time, most of the stuff that was popularly available about Tantra was all the sacred sex stuff, you know, sexual secrets, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, yeah, this is really interesting. I want ritual. Where's the ritual? Where's the magic? You know, find the sex. Actually, I can do without of it because most of it was really heteronormative.
Dr. Hyatt called it something like sex magic for Protestants. Like that.
Yeah, well, you know, I just thought, well, this is kind of like, you know, it was kind of like they hadn't really, they reached a stage later saying, okay, well, this book is written for straight people, but queer people can adapt it because all the energy is the same. I'm not sure I ever agree with that, but at this stage, it was still basically, oh well, yeah. I mean, there was that one book, Sexual Secrets. They actually said something like, oh well, it's okay if it's two women, particularly if there's a man around to watch or manage the energy, but two men. Definitely no. It's bad for your kundalini, chakras, yada, yada, yada. I think they actually said something like gay men use yoga to overcome their own desires.
Yeah.
Because of some batshit theory about the transmission of semen caused karmic entanglements or some shit like that. So, but what I wanted was stuff on ritual. I thought this Tantra stuff can't be either just sex bollocks or really deep and mind twisting philosophy that I can't get my head around. I want ritual. So that's kind of what I started to look for, and it took me quite a long time to find other people who were kind of exploring a ritual magic approach to Tantra, and that was the people I met in Goss, the arcane and mystical order of the Knights of Shambhala. So does that explain that?
It does. When was the moment, or do you have a memory of a moment where it's like, oh yeah, this is for me? Was there a particular text or a particular ritual where it's like, yeah, this is for me?
I don't think it was quite, I would put it quite like that. I think my prior engagement with goddesses was something that drew me to Tantra, because the Tantric traditions that I got to find out about through Mukos were very goddess oriented, and I kind of like that. I think I have a big kind of love. So I kind of like devotional attraction to goddesses anyway. And I think another reason was it was the way of doing ritual I was taught was radically different to the stride around the circle manfully and wave your arms about and do lots of shouting, which was very much the kind of experiences I was having in chaos magic circles. This was a very different approach to ritual. I love the poetry. I love a lot of I just love a lot of the English translations of Sanskrit poetry. I find it incredibly moving. So I don't think I can say anything more than that, really.
No, cool. For people who want to follow up on that, the poetry angle, I would say the lyricism of moving it from one language into the other with thoughtfulness and sensitivity. Do you have any, like, off the top of the head recommendations for people who, not to like begin the process of moving into Tantra, but like examples of what you just said? Are there books that you go, oh, check this out, this is just mwah,
Just trying to think off the top of my head. There's a really good book by a guy called, looking desperately on my bookshelf. Can I find it? No, it's called More Than Real, and it's by a guy called David Shulman. And it's not actually about Indian poetics at all. It's actually, he calls it a history of the imagination in India. And David Shulman's a really excellent translator of Indian and related Salvation materials, but More Than Real is excellent because he kind of, tend not to question the idea of the imagination. And when I read that book, I just thought, wow, their ideas about the imagination are really sophisticated and really different to those that I was used to. And that book was a really good eye opener, I think.
Good choice.
I can send you some stuff later if you want.
Yeah, if you like.
Unfortunately, the books I'm looking for are eluding me. I should say Ram Prasad Sen, who was a 19th century, I think Bengali poet. I might be wrong actually about whether he's Bengali, but definitely check out anything you can find by Ram Prasad Sen. He was a devotee of Kali. And some of his Kali poems I've been using in my ritual work for probably about 30 odd years now. So he's good.
Cool. The imagination point you just made is also there in the book in a couple of ways, and I was interesting because we used to have it right and we got it wrong. If you actually look at some of the decent Hermetic texts, right, you can kind of squint down and see there, again, within a particular sort of Mediterranean context, they're describing what I would say is a similar thing to what is described in a South Asian context that you get when in the self-evidence and the primacy of the imagination or the imaginal is well, it's self-evident. It's not epiphenomena of brain molecules. It's they take it with the seriousness so that, as you say, when you sit with that, when you improve the metaphysics, all of a sudden these very different ritual modes not just become available to you, but you see the potency in them. And what looks simple because it isn't that kind of I used to joke about this with my British friends as well, particularly in a thelemic context, like it is my will, the kind of like wand, will, penis. Okay, it's all very heterosexual missionary, bang away at something until something happens. And it doesn't have that sort of languid humility that is actually deeply powerful. The best thing you can do to kind of get, funnily enough, instrumentalism, the best thing you can do to get your magic to work better is to actually jailbreak the imaginal for yourself and realize that it's profoundly potent.
There's an interesting idea a really interesting idea I came across early on, was this idea that the imagination comes from Sarasvati. So if you have an idea, it's not coming out of you. It's coming, if you like, out of the goddess through you. And I kind of like love that idea in some ways, because it's kind of like, that means that every time you have an idea, it's almost like it's like an idea coming through you and coming back to the goddess through you. So, and there's this wonderful verse in the Lahari. This is this. Well, I don't know whether it's tantric or not arguable, but it's kind of like a poetic, it's like a poetic meditation on the nature of the goddess. And the author, who again is contested, so there's a whole issue. I won't go into it, but it's kind of like, everything I do is a prayer and an offering to you. So my walking, my speech, my sitting down, my having a meal, my having a crap, everything I do is in service and an offering to you. And I really like that sense that of just engagement with life, that it's kind of like it just. I don't know. I can't explain it, but I really like it.
No, it's good. There's a moment in the book where you kind of describe what awake awareness is, and I mean, if you were to, there's. I'll pick up something you just mentioned there as well, because there is persistent challenges, and I'll get you to describe this for people, in kind of circling out or defining out what Tantra is versus other stuff. And when you began it, and this is the stories in the book, there is that kind of fetishized and orientalized notion that it is something separate and sexy and dirty, which was the sort of, in a delicious way, in the kind of 80s sense.
Yeah.
And it misses the culture a bit. But you said something there, which is like, it is actually persistently challenging and almost a fool's errand to go, well, this is Tantra and this isn't Tantra, right?
Let's say it's an enormously complex subject, and I probably am at this point in time more happier saying, okay, this is Tantra, rather than to say that's Tantra, because what I would say is, look what the tradition says. This is something you very interesting in the way Tantra is about. You can always, as I would say, you can always tell somebody who's trying to pull the wool over your eyes because they don't say what the tradition says. They'll tell you what they think, or they'll tell you what any number of authorities think. But for me, it's really important to see, and I think we are seeing this increasingly in a number of recent books about the subject. is actually people are actually going to the tradition and say, okay, this is what the great thinkers of this tradition say about it. So let's take their word for it. I mean, having said that, yes, it is a massive subject, and I think it deserves to be approached and honoured as a massive subject. And yeah, it's not easy to kind of like nail it down, but I think it might be worth making the attempt, but in a very rigorous way.
Yeah. I think where I was going is it blends at the edges into. I mean, it's situated in a very specific collection of cultures, but it blends at the edges into
so many things.
Yeah, because Gnosticism does the same thing, right? Like it's not that it didn't exist. It's my understanding of Tantra anyway, which is far more limited. But it's not that it didn't exist as a separate thing. It did, but it also didn't, because the edges of it are identical to cultural praxes that are in the cultures that it was situated in. So Gnosticism, you can circle around it, and you probably should, but just circle lightly, because at its edges, it's just, again, Near Eastern or Mediterranean 2nd century culture.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Gordon. It's fuzzy at the edges, no? And it's always interesting to look at various historical texts and see how people are kind of ring fencing it.
But we like to do that. We have to. That's a 19th century thing. It's sort of like pinning butterflies on a chalk or a corkboard in the Natural History Museum. We have to kind of put it in boxes.
Yeah, but you could look and find guys of opposing philosophical schools in 7th century India trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, fair enough.
These people are religious hypocrites. They're just in it for the money. The whole thing is predicated on the basis of some successful herbs and spells, but they do not believe in the eternal Vedas. They are tainted by elements of barbarian culture.
I want to say plus ça change there. I want to say the more things change. I like that. That's cool. Before we move on to chakras, because I found this really, really interesting, there's one piece in the book, and it's an example, I think, of what you were just discussing, where encountering tantric texts and rituals in particular in a serious and open way kind of jailbreaks ideas like the imagination. Like, what can we learn from Tantra about how we probably get visualization wrong, for instance?
I think what's interesting about visualization is that, you think visual, you don't necessarily connect up the visual with the emotional. But, and visualization is a hugely important part of tantric practice, but the whole point of the visualization is to provoke an emotion. Cognizant with a particular deity, whether it's love or desire or anger or fury. The whole point of the visualization is to kind of like cause an emotion to well up inside you, to the point where you can become possessed by the essential quality of that deity. So, visualization is also interesting because it works so much with memory. And what I started to find when I was first starting with tantric visualizations is I kind of get as I developed the visualization, I'd get more and more stuff drawn in from previous experiences and previous visualizations. And sometimes I find myself going off on tangents. But yeah, I think the effective side of visualization has been kind of like perhaps not looked at as closely as it could be.
And part of that must be that, let's just take, I don't know, well, you're an occupational therapist, so you understand this, but let's just take visualization as it might have been mobilized in some ostensibly materialist but acceptable 20th century psychological treatment modalities, right? That means it's coming out of a culture that thinks post Descartes that it's not just that essentially the mind is separate from the body, but in particular the imagination is fantasy in the sense that it is non-existent falsehood. Whereas, as we were just discussing, visualization in a tantric context, or in the example you just mentioned, comes out of a culture that considers the imaginal to be a great river goddess that flows through you. Like, so of course, the imaginal.
This is, I grew up with this supposition that if it's visualized, yes, it's great, but it's not as good as the real thing. Why would you visualize, having sex with an imaginary person when you can go out and do the real thing? But certainly within the tantric traditions, to be in, the intense visualization is kind of like hyper real. It's why I think why Schulman calls these more than real.
Mm.
And there's, the understanding that if that visualization is done by somebody who's an adept, then it will have a direct impact on reality.
Yeah, hyperreal is perfect. And the visualizing versus having sex with someone, a practical example, which I like and I vaguely remember from back in the day, is when it comes to offerings. So if you catch yourself, I mean, it's not like don't set lights and don't pour out offerings and so on, far from it.
No, of course not.
But if you need, that's a really good kind of like mental exercise for people listening. It's like, well, let's just say if you make imaginal offerings, are you thinking in your head that they're not as good as the physical ones, and sit with that tension until it isn't? I guess that makes sense.
I was talking at Trebles the other night about yoga powers in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, and it's interesting that one of the powers there is that by mastering speech, essentially by speaking the truth all the time, your words directly affect reality. And it actually says in the comment in this particular commentary on the Yoga Sutra, your speech becomes efficacious. What you say will happen. If I say to you, "Oh, Gordon, be virtuous," you will become virtuous. That's not to say that you're probably not virtuous already, but there's this very strong idea that if we do stuff in our heads, it can't affect reality. And I think that's an idea that I really had to kind of like drop to try and get my head around some ideas in classical Tantra. They just don't see the mind body split in the way we do.
No. Yeah. And you might be underselling it by saying drop. For me, it's like crawling through a thicket or brambles. Like and also it will trip you up. Because of the context we grew up in, you'll find yourself falling into it.
Yeah, I got into this thing about beauty. I know because I'm reading this sort of tantric hymn, and it's talking about this goddess being beautiful, and I think, well, I know what I've got a standard of beauty, which obviously comes out of my culture. What do they think in, say, 10th century Northern India? What is their idea of beauty? And I found myself asking these, I think, quite simple questions that led me down in a quest into whether it was theories of language or theories of aesthetics, just to try and do all these kind of like real intellectual digging exercises, just to try and actually find out what things that I was taking for granted actually meant to the people who were writing this literature. And that became an incredibly important part of the work for me, and then I come back, I think, okay, I know what you mean by beauty now. That's that actually helps me understand why this poem is written in the way it's written.
And presumably the net effect, the sort of additional uplift to that is by focusing on or taking seriously and doing the diligence on what beauty was in that cultural and historical context, it teaches you more about the understanding of beauty you've both inherited and that you hold for yourself, because you kind of have an additional perspective to kind of look back on, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Which brings me neatly to, I was thinking about this as putting the questions together. And you just quite recently done a series of lectures and publications on the chakras. And I'm trying to find if there's maybe something more emblematic than the chakras of the whole story of Northwest European, in particular British, I guess, encounter with South Asian cosmology in a historical context that goes from the 18th century to the 21st century, with the kind of number and function of chakras we have that you'll get at your yoga studio in California. Mm-hmm. And it's actually it's an endlessly fascinating topic, but it's an emblematic one. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think so. I was chatting to somebody earlier on Twitter tonight about chakras. I say it's real interesting. We have this huge discourse about there being 7 chakras. Books, teas, whatever, the whole thing. People just take it as read, and they have experiences that attest to the truth of this fact. Yes, I felt my Mooladhara Chakra opening. Yes, I know I have 7 chakras, yada, yada, yada. And, I know from bitter experience that if you actually question people this and say, well, I don't think the chakras are real, they get really upset. And say, no, I've had X, Y, Z experiences. I know they're real. I feel them buzzing and opening and closing and all that in my body. I remember, and I've had similar experiences. Looking back when I was one of the interesting things about the process of writing Hine's Varieties was going back and looking at my magical diaries from the 1980s, and I'm finding experiences where I'm talking about, I felt my Mooladhara Chakra open, blah blah blah. And I think for me, it says something quite wonderful about the plasticity of the human body mind to be able to shape our internal experiences according to an external schema that we then just accept as a fact. Because people really do say, I've heard people talking about chakras, so it's like it's like they might use the same kind of like language and tonalities to describe their lungs. They're as real as lungs for some people. But one of the things that interested me as I dug deeper into the not only Tantra, but also that kind of like colonial contact zone between kind of like, if you like, Western esotericism and Indian esoteric religions is where did these ideas come from? I got fascinated with that, and I've actually wanted to do a series of lectures on the passage of the ideas about chakras from, if you like, from India to Europe for a very long time now. And last year I managed to find the time to do that. And one of my friends said to me, you're doing all this research, Phil. Why don't you write them up as little booklets? I thought, wow, that's quite a cool idea. And I did, and I found it was quite incredibly hard work to prepare for one lecture and do the previous lecture as a booklet, but I kind of managed it. And it's actually the first time I've done any self-publishing since the mid-90s. So I was kind of blown away at how much easier it had got, and how, it was just quite an enjoyable experience. And my partner did a lot of the illustration work, and that was a really good collaboration between her artistic skills and my kind of like Photoshop skills. So doing the 4 little booklets was quite a good thing, because I guess if I'd set out to write a book, I probably still would have been at it. But doing 4 little booklets was actually not that big a task.
Creative restriction, it forces you to do different things. A book can be endless, but if it's a booklet and you have a defined date, out it comes.
And it was fascinating to just see people to respond to it, because I took a very kind of like short timeline, really. I mean, the first booklet is a kind of like general part of the, like an introduction to the series lecture, and then I kind of like dive into some very, if you like, abbreviated stuff about different chakra schemas within the tantric tradition, and are they related to Ayurveda? No. Are they, related to this, and where does this come from? And that is kind of like, it's very much a rush through, but I think, I like to think enough of tasters to get people to go away and look at the material themselves, because of course, bibliography and all that. And then the second book looks at how the chakras, how the first English language writing about the chakras was done, and that was largely in the context of the Theosophical Society, which is, the early editions of that are all digitized, and that was a great resource. So I looked at how early theosophical writings talk about the chakras, and then looked at how I think Madame Blavatsky gets hold of them, and a couple of other theosophists, and then and Crowley as well. And not many people know this, but Crowley was actually the first Western esotericist to actually give practical exercises on chakras. So, if you like, all the millions of chakra workbooks that are out there nowadays owe something to Aleister Crowley.
That's cool.
Yeah. And he adds chakras as well. He's got a clitoris chakra and a bum chakra and a womb chakra. A lot of his work was on chakras was influenced by this guy called Swami Sabapathy, who wrote a very, I think, what now will be seen to be a very bizarre book on chakras in the 1870s. And then the third book I did was a kind of compare and contrast between Sir John Woodruff's famous book, The Serpent Power, and Charles Webster Ledbetter's The Chakras, a monograph. That I see both of those are kind of as two foundational texts in different ways. And then the last book in the series was a look at Jung, and then a brief trip into the kind of like wellness and therapy culture, and how chakras again reflect a kind of like a neoliberal discourse about entrepreneurial selfhood.
Yeah, that's a perfect way of describing
it. That's what the books are about. I mean, I would like to write them up into some kind of bigger project, but I think that's probably going to have to wait for a while.
So, a couple of questions then. Presumably, the notion of chakras that either imported itself or was, however you want to describe it, appropriated into 19th century European spirituality by that point, had itself changed over time. So
completely, yeah.
So, I mean, let's see let's talk about like earliest mention of chakras versus what it was when it was imported into European culture. Do you know what I mean? Because I think that's a key to understand that it, even within South Asia, it was quite a highly mutative concept as well.
Well, some sources, the earliest mentions of chakras are in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, which is about 4th century. Personally, I'm not sure I would say about that, but I would say definitely we start to see chakras appearing in early Tantric literature around the 5th century AD. And actually, the 7 chakra schema has been pretty much well tied down to one particular text of the Kubjika tradition, which is about 5th, 16th century. But all the time, the thing about chakras within tantric traditions is that they are tradition specific. So different traditions have different sets of chakras, and also sometimes they are text specific. I mean, I can think of at least one text that gives 2 different chakra arrangements, neither of which seem to relate to each other, but they're specific to that tradition. But I think it has a set of 7 chakras and a set of 5 chakras. Or that's a huge simplification. So the chakra schemas are not kind of like standardized, and in fact they don't become standardized really until I would say the early 20th century, by which time they've started to be incorporated into Western esotericism. And they're not really standardized nowadays, because occasionally somebody will pop up and go, I think Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki did this several years ago. She wrote this book, and she said, "There's an 8th chakra. You know where it is. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink." And now there are still people riffing on that, say, "Oh, it's a 9th chakra or a 10th chakra." But the 7 chakra model, I think, has become in a way ubiquitous for several reasons. Just one, I think, is textual overload. And the fact that 7 is a big number in Western metaphysics.
Is was the ontology of chakras more or less fixed over that 1.2 thousand year period?
No.
Okay, so
I don't think it was at all. I mean, there are actually some Indian, if you like, internal body arrangements which don't have chakras at all.
So they weren't always sort of like semi-physical cosmic organs, or like I said, energy center doesn't describe it as tightly.
Energy centers doesn't really come into it.
Yeah.
What they are is, in particularly in a lot of the early texts, is that they are seats for goddesses. They're literally zones of the body where you implant deities in order to worship your own body as a kind of like as a house for deities to live in. Because a big part of Indian religion at the time is you worship deities and they must have somewhere. So you either put them on the ground or in a particular place or in your body. And putting them in your body is a very portable way of doing it. And particularly in the early texts, I mean, this idea that you have chakras all the time was just a nonsense, because the idea is that you built the chakras through, you actually created them through visualization. You installed deities in them to do different types of deity yoga practice. And then, when you stopped doing that practice and moved on to the practice, to a different practice, you might use an entirely different set of chakras. So no, it wasn't normalized at all. And these practices were often, as I say, tradition specific. What you did tend to get was a certain degree of the naming of chakras, if you like, across different traditions. Like the Mooladhara Chakra was tended to become the lowest one in a series, but whether that was actually the one, the seventh one or the fifth one or the third one, again, there was a great deal of difference depending on the different traditions.
And does that mean that there's, as you say, they differed between traditions? If they were contemporaneous and there are seats for goddesses, and once you're done with a particular set of exercises or working with that particular range of goddesses that require seats, and you can kind of, would you in your head, here's a way of saying it, is the underlying cosmology or just ontology of chakras that as goddess seats, does that allow you to move, if you were in the 11th century and a tantric, to move to like the next text or the next collection of rituals or modes of being and not have a dysfunction? Do you know what I mean? In your head, like, okay, well, these seats, I've seated these goddesses, now I'm going to do this practice of seating, some of the same, some not, and so it's almost like the underlying worldview is seats for goddesses. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, that's a difficult question, because some traditions were fairly kind of like antagonistic to each other, and others borrowed from each other. So I guess this would be very much dependent, and I'm hesitant, I guess, on what the guru says.
Sure.
Because this is the other thing about the tantric tradition; it's amazingly heterodox. So the impressions. This is the problem with reading text, is that text can only give you part of the story. You don't get the down the ground story. But and whilst there are many bad things about gurus, we all know, the good things is that if your guru says, yeah, you can do this, then you're empowered to do it. And if another one says, well, no, you can't do that, then you could just sod you. I'm going to find someone else who'll let me do it. So I don't really know, but I guess it would depend on whether people thought, because what you get in Tantra is this real kind of like a sense of competition between traditions. It's kind of like, well, our tradition is good, and those other traditions, yada, 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 are all just kind of like, yeah, they're okay, but they're not as good as us. We're strawberry flavored. We're the highest tradition. Those other traditions are just kind of like steps on the way to our tradition, which is the best tradition. If you're following those other traditions, well, you're okay, but what you ultimately have to recognize is the gods of those traditions are just kind of like, aspects of our God, who's the best God. So you do get this sense of competition between different traditions. It's kind of like a continual one-upmanship thing.
Sure. So a follow-up question, it's an annoying chaos magic one, right? Which is, if we've had this tremendous semantic drift of what, or ontological drift of what chakras are over the last 130 years in the West. Can you make a case, if people were looking to experiment, and obviously almost just for the fun of it, but it does necessarily imply that if you as a magical practitioner were wanting to warp that tradition a little bit back in that direction, you could do a seats for deities version, like not like your own one, but you go, okay, well, so we've ended up via an historical process of having this kind of classical 7, which doesn't really match the Indian context that it came out of. But now that I know that, now that I know that it's a seat-based thing, it's like, well, rather than having it embedded in that 20th century self-improvement notion, go, okay, well, I'm just going to start seeding things in them.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, why not?
I mean, the original text, the original material, textual translations are becoming available. So there's that. There are people teaching these ancient methods nowadays. There's a guy called Chris Tompkins who's, I think, doing his PhD on early ideas of chakras and kundalini, and he's done several courses which I've listened to, and there's other people teaching these if you like more traditional approaches to, well, no, traditional is the wrong word, but these radically different approaches to the chakras. But I was talking to some American guy a couple of years ago, and I was saying, well, you could have queer chakras where the objective is to experience different states of ecstasy, which are not tied to, neoliberal goals of self-improvement, but are just tied to just having a good time, And he was kind of like, oh, that sounds interesting. So, yeah, I think it's possible to start, once you kind of like jump out of the mindset that we're used to, you can actually start to think, wow, there's some really interesting ideas here. And I think that's another of my interests in Tantra. It is so radically different to anything that we're used to. And I think that, the tendency just to go along with all the stuff that's been just reproduced over the past 100 years in Western occultism about the mystic East, we're actually missing out on some quite cool tech, if you want to, put it in those terms.
Yeah, and seat tech is one of them. Like, if the queer Tantra, the queer chakras is a good example. Like, well, what would you like to seat in your body? Is kind of like an interesting.
It's that Deleuzian question: what is a body capable of?
Yeah. Well, that's food for thought to and an invitation to experimentation to leave.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, this has been a splendid chat, and I really, really enjoyed the book. I think it's a spell in its own right. It's a very clever arrangement, and so.
Oh, thank you very much.
Well, and thank you very, very much for your time, and for people who want to know more about yourself and where they can find you and the other things you've got going on. Now is the time to lay it upon us.
Okay, well, the best place to come to is my blog, which is at http://enfolding.org. And any new publications or projects and occasional bits of writing will be on there. And Hine's Varieties is available from hopefully all good bookshops and directly from Original Falcon Publications, either as hard copy or as EPUB or format, as indeed all my other books, Prime Chaos, Condensed Chaos, and the Pseudonomicon.
Nice one. Well, thank you so much once again. Great book and fantastic chat.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gordon.
Nice one. In the show notes, you'll find that Phil sent through some of his tantric poetry recommendations for those who are interested in learning more. And of course, there's links to getting his latest book and Phil's website and all that sort of stuff. Based on today's chat, I want to table a possibly fun thought exercise that doesn't have much to do with the show per se. It's sort of show adjacent. But it is a useful notion to think with. Is it more or less appropriative to be inspired by, shall we say, a corrected or improved history of the chakras? What I mean is, so the goddess seat notion can be widened out to cover, for example, the installation of planets or even planetary angels in the parts of the body governed by said planets. Such techniques bring chakras, funnily enough, into alignment with actual shamanism, which is to say Central Eurasian spirit customs. And there are similar techniques in Aboriginal Australia and so on. But is doing that more or less appropriative? The case for less is that we can see it as a small corrective to 150 years ago Europeans seeing what they wanted to see, which wasn't strictly there, as Phil talked us through today, and porting that from South Asia and then correcting it, right? Quote unquote correcting it, which is potentially the yardstick for genuine appropriation, when you can use the A word of bringing something in. Learning from cultures or between cultures is great, but improving on it is a bold statement, right? So the case for differently, if that was the case for less, the case for differently is that we, I guess, might just be doing the same thing minus the corrective part. And again, the corrective part is the far more grievous sin. But I just wonder if that isn't intellectually lazy. To say, oh, it's still appropriative, because the word itself really needs to be interrogated. It can be used as a very intellectually lazy, centrist, identitarian idea that nobody's food should touch, and it's actually based on, or it emerges from a mode of seeing the world that isn't up to code for the 21st century. So I'm going to make the case for that thought exercise being less. And funnily enough, somewhere in this thought exercise is an example of what I meant by optimize for optimization. This is what happens when you turn chaos magic's prioritization of results, we might say, back on the epistemologies and resting cosmologies you begin with. And so with consideration and attention and respect, when you do that, the process of experimentation, which is fundamental to chaos magic, becomes far more satisfactory. And so that's potentially what I mean by what I meant in the show. In fact, it is what I meant in the show by chaos magic containing the seed of its own redemption, if you view it, as I kind of opened Pieces of 8 with, as being optimized for optimization. Anyway, speaking of satisfactory, I suppose, if you find this show satisfactory, feel free to subscribe and share and all that stuff. And before we finish up the episode, I'm excited to announce that the H1 2020 astrology episode with Austin Kopic is next week, and it will be live and video, and we'll be answering live questions. For most of you, that will be on Wednesday evening. That's sort of where it is for the US. And there will be a post coming up about it in the next few days with more details and so on. But, cannot wait for that one. But of course, I'm going to have to. And on that note, until next time.